They were the couple that made the congregation weep with awe. He, the fiery street prophet with tattoos of scripture across his knuckles. She, the soft-spoken first lady who never missed a prayer call. Together, they preached deliverance, holiness, obedience. But behind those sermons and Sunday smiles was a hell that no altar call could redeem. Their gospel was control. Their rituals spilled blood. And the woman praised for her faith was, in truth, a prisoner in her own home, chained, starved, and once beaten with a Bible until her teeth shattered. How does devotion curdle into domination? How does a marriage morph into a covenant of silence and suffering? And what finally happens when the first lady of the church stops praying and starts fighting back? Before we expose this twisted tale of worship and wickedness, like this video and subscribe for more true stories that unmask the demons hiding behind pulpits, wedding bands, and whispered amens. Teondra Lachelle Dews moved through life with the kind of grace that made her nearly invisible, quiet, polished, humble. At 58, she had long been a comforting presence in Shreveport's medical community. As a hospital case manager, she was the calm voice guiding broken families through their darkest hours. Patients called her Miss T. Nurses loved her for her gentle humor. And in every hallway, her presence felt like a soft hymn. Teondra didn't curse. She fasted regularly. She kept her Bible tucked in her purse like a shield. God, she believed, was her anchor. And love, real love, was supposed to be a gift from him. But for Teondra, love came wrapped in scripture and soaked in fear. She met Cordell Dews at a prayer rally held in a car lot off Linwood Avenue. He was impossible to ignore. Broad-shouldered, with a gold tooth and a preacher's cadence, he didn't ask for attention, he demanded it. Clad in a dashiki and Timberlands, Cordell called himself a prophet of the streets, mixing the raw fire of Pentecostalism with black Hebrew Israelite prophecy. He told those gathered that the black man was God's chosen, that women were to submit or perish, and that demons could live in your household, hiding in your children, your spouse, your reflection. Teondra had never heard doctrine like his. It terrified her. And yet, it stirred something else, something she mistook for spiritual awakening. He singled her out after the rally, called her Queen Mother, told her God had shown him her face in a dream. She flushed, smiled, and within weeks, she was seated on a folding chair in the back of his garage-turned-tabernacle, the house of cleansing fire. The house wasn't much. A battered garage strung with red lights and scriptures taped to the walls. A tub in the corner for full immersion baptisms. A pulpit fashioned from stacked milk crates. But Cordell made it sacred. He preached with a fury that made grown men cry. He shouted until sweat pooled at his feet, then would weep into his hands like a man possessed. He claimed he had been delivered from dope and darkness by a visitation from Yah himself. No more cocaine. No more street hustling. He was reborn, and now he'd been anointed to lead others into the fire and out the other side. Teondra believed him. She wanted to. She had lived a quiet life. Worked, prayed, went home. Her first husband had died in a car accident when she was just 33. No children, no drama, and no love since. So when Cordell took her hand in front of his tiny congregation and called her the Mother of Zion, she said yes. She married him 4 months later in a backyard ceremony officiated by his cousin, a man with no license, but plenty of fire and brimstone. For the first year, Teondra felt honored. Cordell made her feel chosen. She cooked for the congregation, washed the feet of visiting prophets. He called her his rib. He said she had a silent strength and a womb blessed by the Most High. But over time, the teachings changed, hardened. The scriptures of dominion, his self-written doctrine, grew darker. Women were commanded to sleep at the feet of their husbands. Discipline was divine, and submission was no longer symbolic. Cordell began to isolate her. First, from her friends Jezebels, he called them. Then, from her co-workers, agents of Babylon. He removed her cell phone, installed cameras in the home. When she questioned him, he'd scream scripture until she collapsed in tears. He called it casting out the spirit of rebellion. Once, when she tried to leave for church alone, he dragged her by her hair and locked her in the laundry room for 8 hours, quoting proverbs through the door. Still, to outsiders, they were holy, devout, a perfect match. Cordell posted pictures of them online during fasts and feast days, his arm draped around her shoulders like a loving shepherd. Teondra was always dressed in long skirts and head wraps, her eyes lowered. No one noticed the bruises beneath the fabric. No one heard the midnight exorcisms or the screams behind brick walls when Cordell made her confess impure thoughts under threat of fasting, flogging, or cold showers in the dead of night. Behind closed doors, the house of cleansing fire was less a ministry than a dungeon. A kingdom built on obedience, where Cordell reigned as prophet, judge, and executioner, and where Teondra, for 22 years, served as his most loyal disciple and most broken captive. Cordell's gospel was never about salvation, it was about domination. In the dim corners of their home, sanctified in paranoia and pain, he fashioned himself a lawgiver, carving out 77 commandments by hand in a leather-bound book he called the Scroll of Divine Order. These weren't commandments from Scripture. These were his own twisted decrees, masked in prophecy and rage. Every law tailored to break Teondra down, to rebuild her in his image. She had to wear white daily, a symbol of her eternal submission. She was forbidden from speaking unless spoken to. She was to sleep at the foot of their bed like a dog, his Lamb of Zion. She was required to fast for 72 hours every month, with no water after sundown. And twice a week, she had to endure what Cordell called marital purification, a brutal ritual masked as sex, where she wasn't permitted to speak, move, or cry. He controlled every breath of her life. Her phone was locked under a password only he knew. He deleted her contacts, told her family she was on retreat, purifying herself from Babylonian spirits. When her sister drove across town to check on her, Cordell met her at the door with a Bible and a gun holstered on his hip, warning her that the prophet's house was sacred ground. Cordell charted her body like holy terrain. He tracked her ovulation in a handmade notebook, marking red X's and stars across calendars as though her womb were his sanctuary. If she missed a prayer, he forced her into hours of silent kneeling, her back straight, her eyes fixed on a candle, the wax dripping down until it hit her skin. When he sensed disobedience, she was made to kneel on uncooked rice, her knees sliced and bruised, the grains embedding in her flesh. He'd walk circles around her, reading from his so-called scriptures, demanding that she confess the demons of rebellion. Once, he made her stay silent for an entire week under the guise of holy meditation. She wasn't allowed to speak, write, or hum. Her voice faded by day 3. Her throat, already weakened by years of suppressed sobs and forced fasts, gave out. When she broke down in tears, he poured cold oil on her head and whispered, "The spirit is weak, but your vessel is mine." It wasn't always fist and fear. Sometimes, the most sinister moments were quiet. Rituals of psychological suffocation. Cordell would make her repeat affirmations into a mirror. "I am chosen. I am the vessel. I am clay." He would wipe her down with oil, spit, and other bodily fluids, calling it a sacrament of sealing. He'd whisper scriptures while she lay trembling, unable to tell if she was being purified or punished. But Teondra remembered who she had once been. She couldn't scream, couldn't call out, but she could write. She tore pages from old hymnals, wrote in code, and stashed her journal inside the ceiling vent in the laundry room. Each entry was a cry for help without volume, a final act of resistance in a world where her body wasn't her own. That journal, nearly destroyed by mildew and dust, would later tell the story she never got to speak. Each blood-stained page was a testimony. Each tear-warped sentence, a wound. Behind closed doors, Cordell Dews turned religion into ritualized torture. And Teondra, still dressed in white, still silent, walked the line between martyr and hostage, waiting for God, or death, to set her free. By early 2024, the chains around Teondra's soul had begun to rust. Her children were grown and gone. 2 boys and a daughter who had always sensed something was wrong, but never had the full picture. Cordell kept them at arm's length with calculated righteousness, only allowing visits during tightly controlled holy hours. But once they left the house for good, something shifted. The silence gave Teondra room to breathe, and in that breath, rebellion took root. She reached out to her estranged sister, the one Cordell always spat about with venom, calling her a Jezebel and a demon in lipstick. That sister had once banged on the front door and cursed Cordell to hell when he told her to stay away. And now, Teondra whispered to her through a burner phone, each conversation quick and trembling. Her sister helped her set up a hidden apartment on the other side of Shreveport. A new phone, a storage unit, a cash stash, a lawyer under an alias. Teondra was inches away from freedom. She packed little by little, hiding her escape in grocery bags and laundry baskets. On February 6, 2025, she told him, "I'm leaving, Cordell. I've filed for divorce." He didn't scream. He didn't punch a wall. He just stared at her with a strange calm, the kind that sends bone-deep fear through a woman who knows a storm when she sees one. Then he asked her to do one thing before she left: kneel and pray, like you did the day we were married. And Teondra, heart-pounding, tears threatening, did what she'd always done. She obeyed. As her knees hit the floor, Cordell reached behind the pulpit he kept in their living room and pulled out the revolver. The same one he'd once shown her during a lesson on protection. He raised it slowly, like it was part of a sermon, and aimed it at the back of her bowed head. The first shot echoed like thunder in a chapel, but it didn't kill her. She screamed, fell forward, blood leaking into the carpet. She begged him with her last breath, choking on tears and disbelief. Cordell knelt beside her, kissed her trembling forehead, and whispered, "You already dead to me, woman." Then came the knife. He stabbed her 24 times. 17 times in her abdomen, where their children once grew. 6 times in her breasts, symbols, he said, of nurturing betrayal. And once through her right eye. The window of rebellion, he hissed, as if gouging out a demon. But it wasn't enough to kill her. He had to cleanse her. Cordell washed her lifeless body in milk and honey, quoting verses from his own twisted scripture. He dressed her in white, tying a silk sash around her waist like it was her wedding night all over again. Then he placed her in his leather preaching chair, the one he refused to let anyone else sit in. Her body slumped in ritualistic peace, blood soaking through her white robe. He lit candles shaped like Hebrew letters, smeared her blood across the living room wall with shaking hands, painting words that reeked of madness and delusion. Death before divorce. Union never broken. He carved one final word into her abdomen with the same knife he'd used to end her life: Judas. And when the police arrived, tipped off by her sister after hours of silence, they found Cordell sitting naked in front of her corpse, ash smeared across his body, oil dripping down his face. He was rocking back and forth, whispering to himself in tongues, his eyes wild with something that had long stopped being God. From a Bluetooth speaker on the windowsill, Marvin Sapp's Never Would Have Made It looped on repeat. The haunting chorus played again and again, the same line like a taunt. Never would have made it without you. And in the house once called holy, now soaked in blood, the prophet of the streets had finally completed his gospel. When Cordell Dews stood trial, he didn't walk into the courtroom like a broken man. He walked in barefoot, shackled, and humming scripture. His dreadlocks were matted with oil. He wore a tattered white linen tunic beneath a beige jumpsuit, his attempt at holy vestments behind bars. To the court, he pled not guilty by reason of spiritual insanity, claiming divine instruction had guided every act. But what unfolded in that courtroom was not madness. It was method, ritualistic, filmed, and commodified. Prosecutors dismantled the illusion piece by piece. The first bombshell: Cordell had wired every inch of their home with hidden cameras. Bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, and garage. Hundreds of hours of footage, all time-stamped and meticulously archived, were discovered on encrypted drives. But it wasn't just storage. Cordell had been uploading the footage for years to a sick corner of the dark web, a private forum titled Wives Under Dominion. For a subscription fee, anonymous users could watch his soul-cleansing rituals. In court, the jury watched clips that reduced the gallery to gasps and sobs. Teondra waterboarded in the bathtub, her screams drowned by his chanting, "Cleanse Jezebel! Cleanse Jezebel!" Her sobbing through forced oral sex while Cordell moaned scripture. Her crawling on all fours, nude, as he beat her back and legs with a leather-bound Bible, commanding, "Recite the commandments, harlot." The branding. A red-hot iron etched the image of a dove wrapped in chains onto her inner thigh. The date on the footage, the same day she mentioned wanting a divorce. Cordell called it marital atonement. The prosecution called it what it was, torture pornography. Worse. Monetized torture, commodified for a secret congregation of deviants who paid to watch a woman be destroyed in the name of God. Then came the second horror. Midway through the trial, a cold case unit from Claiborne Parish contacted the prosecution. While searching Cordell's grandfather's now-abandoned church property, cadaver dogs alerted to a shallow grave beneath an overgrown prayer garden. Inside, they found skeletal remains. Beside the remains, a rusted VHS tape labeled First Sacrifice, wrapped in silk cloth and sealed in a shoebox. The body was quickly identified through dental records. Martrice Langley, Cordell's high school girlfriend. She had disappeared in 1993. Her mother had always suspected foul play, but no body, no confession, and no suspect ever surfaced until now. In court, investigators described the tape. On it, grainy footage of Martrice, bound and sobbing, in what appeared to be a church basement. Cordell appeared in frame, younger but already lost in the madness. He read aloud from an early draft of the Scriptures of Dominion, then slit her throat with the same ceremonial knife used on Teondra. The courtroom went cold. Cordell had not just been a violent husband. He had been a predator for over 3 decades. A self-made prophet with a theology of pain, a preacher who didn't save souls. He harvested them. By the end of the trial, there were no more murmurs of divine calling. Just a courtroom filled with silence, heavy with the weight of every woman who had once knelt before him in love and found herself on her knees in terror. The cult had been exposed. But for Teondra and Martrice, the revelation had come too late. Cordell was sentenced to 2 life sentences plus 145 years. He smirked during sentencing and whispered, "She'll come back." They always do. By the time the verdict was read, the courthouse was surrounded by a sea of anger and mourning. Posters with Teondra's face, serene, eyes closed in prayer, lined the fences. Her name had become a rallying cry, her death a national wound. News vans lined the streets. Candlelight vigils burned nightly. Outside the courtroom, women held signs that read, "Her silence was sacred." You turned it into screams. And stop sanctified abuse. Religious leaders from across denominations condemned Cordell's bastardized theology. Ministers called it hell-drenched heresy. Islamic scholars, Black Hebrew leaders, and mainstream Christian pastors united in a rare chorus of outrage. They disavowed the Scriptures of Dominion as a manifesto of madness. Feminist groups mobilized instantly. Organizations that had long warned of spiritual coercion and fringe sects demanded national investigations into faith-based domestic abuse. They held panels, wrote op-eds, marched in cities from Shreveport to D.C. One survivor of a separate religious cult held a photo of Teondra and shouted through tears, "She died with scripture on her lips and wounds on her body." Inside the courtroom, justice moved with grave finality. Cordell stood at sentencing with the same arrogant calm he wore during his trial. No tears, no remorse, just the smirk of a man who still thought he was the chosen one. Then, from the gallery, Teondra's daughter rose. Clutching a folded paper, yellowed, creased, and stained from years of hiding, she stepped to the podium and read aloud the final words her mother had ever written. "If you're hearing this, I didn't escape. But my story will. Don't pray for me. Tell the truth." A hush fell over the room. Judges, bailiffs, even reporters blinked back emotion. Cordell didn't flinch. As the judge sentenced him to 2 life terms plus 145 years without the possibility of parole, he leaned forward and whispered, more to himself than anyone else, she'll come back. They always do. It was the last sermon he'd ever preach outside a prison wall. But Teondra's voice had already risen from the grave, and the echoes of her horror would haunt a nation long after the ash and oil had dried. After the gavel dropped and Teondra Dews was led away in shackles, the world moved forward, but Shreveport couldn't forget. The weight of what happened inside that modest brick house on Allendale Street lingered like smoke after fire. What Teondra left behind wasn't just a body. It was an echo of religious perversion, a scar etched into both flesh and memory. In the months following his sentencing, Teondra was transferred to Angola Prison, Louisiana's most notorious penitentiary. But even behind concrete and steel, he remained a menace. He tried to establish a prison ministry called the Final Covenant, preaching to fellow inmates about blood pacts of salvation and convincing at least 3 to slice their palms open during what he called blood communion. Corrections officers found makeshift altars in his cell. Bible pages folded into crowns, human hair twisted into crosses, and fingernail carvings of Hebrew letters scratched into the walls. His followers didn't last long. One inmate gouged out his own eye after a spirit fast Teondra ordered. Another tried to hang himself in the chapel. Teondra was attacked twice in under a month, once with a sharpened spoon, once with a Bible turned to shiv. After the second assault, he was deemed a high-risk religious radical and placed in permanent solitary confinement. Guards say his cell is soundproof, but every night at exactly 3:33 a.m., a blood-chilling scream echoes down the corridor. Teondra, over and over, until his voice breaks. He scrawls her name into his food trays. Teondra's funeral was packed to the doors. Hundreds came. Women she had prayed for. Nurses she had mentored. Neighbors who once envied her marriage, now racked with guilt. Her sister, once estranged, stood by the casket in white, matching the dress Teondra was buried in, her final act of defiant purity. Speakers took the pulpit to honor her. But it wasn't just a eulogy. It was a rallying cry. Within weeks, a coalition of pastors, legal scholars, and abuse survivors drafted what became known as the Teondra Law, a sweeping piece of legislation aimed at recognizing and prosecuting spiritual abuse. The proposed bill includes mandatory oversight for unlicensed religious groups, legal definitions of ritual-based domestic violence, protections for spouses coerced into religious isolation, a state-run registry of fringe ministries operating without accountability. The law is currently under review by the Louisiana state legislature. Opponents call it a slippery slope and claim it threatens religious freedom. Supporters say freedom isn't freedom when it becomes a cage. Teondra's journal was published posthumously by her daughter as Ashes in White, the testimony of a silenced wife. It became a bestseller, not just for its horror, but for its clarity. Every page chronicled pain with grace. Every line was an indictment of how easily abuse hides in the garments of holiness. University theology programs began teaching it alongside texts on religious trauma. Survivors across the South began coming forward, women and men, who had once sat beneath Teondra's teachings or similar ones. They had stories too. Now, they had a voice. And though Teondra Lachelle Dews would never speak again, her final prayer had been answered, not with vengeance, but with truth. A truth that burned through scripture and skin, until only ashes remained. This wasn't just a murder, it was a prophecy fulfilled in reverse. A 22-year sermon of suffering delivered not from a pulpit, but through bruises, silence, and submission. The silence of the pews that praised Teondra while his wife wasted away. The silence of a system that still refuses to see spiritual abuse as real, as violent, as deadly. So we ask, how do we distinguish devotion from domination? When does faith stop healing and start harming? Who watches the sanctuaries, the living rooms turned sanctuaries, and the predators dressed in ropes? And more urgently, who will speak for the women who still kneel, still fast, still cry behind locked phones and barred windows, hoping their suffering is somehow holy? If Teondra's story moved you, if her voice echoed inside you the way it was meant to, don't let it end here. Share it. Speak it. Make noise for those still trapped in silent prisons with Bibles on their nightstands and bruises on their backs. Like, subscribe, raise awareness. Because what happened to Teondra isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of reckoning. And somewhere, someone is praying for a way out. Let them know they're not alone.